Welcome to the Playing Books podcast. Today we are taking a really fascinating historical journey, looking closely at the mind of, well, one of the 20th century's most complex and strategically significant figures, Chairman Mao Zedong. We've been digging into this specific book, Anna Louise Strong, 3 interviews with Chairman Mao Zedong. And this isn't just, a dry historical account. This particular episode is really about understanding how a key Western journalist, Anna Louise Strong, acted as a kind of filter, maybe a conduit, capturing and then transmitting Mao's core philosophical and political ideas during a super volatile period. We're talking 1959, 1964, and 1965. These conversations, they give us this incredibly intimate, almost unvarnished window into his thinking right before the huge upheaval of the Cultural Revolution.
That's exactly right. And our mission today, it's sort of twofold, really. First, we absolutely need to understand the life story of Strong herself. I mean, it's remarkable, often quite dramatic. She moves from being this advocate for the Soviet system to really championing the Chinese Revolution. It's quite a shift. Second, and this is maybe the core of it, we're trying to distill Mao's key philosophical takeaways from these interviews. His ideas on perpetual struggle, the nature of global power, imperialism, and of course that famous concept he shared with her, the paper tiger. That idea, that framework, it's really the key insight we need to unpack fully in this episode.
Okay, right. So let's start with the messenger then, because Anna Louise Strong, or ALS as she's often called, her life story, honestly, it reads like some kind of geopolitical thriller. She was born way back in 1885, and she had this incredibly strong academic start. Get this. A PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago in 1908.
Wow, 1908.
Yeah, but she was clearly never cut out for, the quiet life in academia. She just dove headfirst into radical politics. Most famously, perhaps, in the Seattle labor movement. She was actively involved in the big 1919 general strike there, which was a huge moment in American labor history. So she wasn't just watching history happen. She was really trying to shape it from the get-go.
Absolutely. And her, let's say, ideological compass is pointing very firmly towards revolutionary movements pretty early on. That's what led her to the Soviet Union in 1921. And for the next, 2 decades, Strong was, you could argue, the most famous American journalist offering this deeply sympathetic viewpoint on Soviet domestic policy.
Right.
Really influential.
She even edited the Moscow Daily News.
That's right. She was the editor there. So she was really instrumental in shaping how the West, especially the left-leaning West, saw that early socialist experiment unfolding in Russia.
But the revolutionary tide, it seems, soon pulled her towards Asia. She made a couple of trips to China early on that really show her, her fearlessness and her growing closeness to the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP leadership. In 1925, she managed to cross the blockade into what they were calling Red Canton. And she did this with help from high-ranking Soviet advisors, the Borodins.
Right, Mikhail Borodin and his wife. And that was just the beginning. It was followed by an even riskier journey, really. 2 years later, in 1927, after the Shanghai Massacre.
A truly brutal event.
Oh, absolutely horrific. When the Kuomintang, the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, violently turned on their communist allies, well, Strong had to flee the city of Hankou, and she fled with Mikhail Borodin himself.
And this wasn't some comfortable train ride.
No, not at all. They escaped across the Gobi Desert in an open car. Just try to picture that. The physical hardship, the political danger.
Unbelievable.
It really cemented her reputation, not just as a reporter, but as someone deeply committed, a confidant, an ally of the revolutionary cause in China.
And that role really crystallized, didn't it, into being an active political messenger in 1940. She was back in China, met secretly with Zhu Enlai in Chongqing, and this was such a critical time.
Yeah, relations between the CCP and the KMT were falling apart fast, even though on paper they were allies against Japan.
Right.
And Zhu Enlai, he obviously saw Strong as this trustworthy, maybe impartial channel to the West. He gave her secret documents, basically laying out the CCP side of the story about these rising tensions, and crucially predicting a major clash.
The South Anway incident.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when that disaster happened, just as predicted, she published the documents in the U.S. press. And it was a bombshell.
So why was publishing that specific information, that prediction, why was it so incredibly important for the CCP internationally at that moment?
Well, because the dominant narrative in the U.S., in the West generally, was heavily biased towards Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, the KMT. They often portrayed the internal conflict as, the legitimate government just dealing with some communist bandits or rebels. Strong Publishing those documents completely shattered that narrative.
Ah, okay.
It detailed the KMT's aggression, their hostility towards the communists, proving the CCP's warnings were credible. It showed they were prescient. Strong basically proved she could be this uncensored voice for Beijing, bypassing the official KMT line.
Which leads us straight into that really foundational period, 1946 to 1947, when she spent time in Yan'an, the CCP's wartime base. This is where her relationship with Mao Zedong himself really solidified. She had multiple meetings with him there, and it was in these conversations happening while the revolution was literally being fought in the hills around them
Yeah, quite the setting.
that she first heard him articulate the paper tiger's concept in its early form. This was the intellectual groundwork for the much deeper discussions they'd have years later.
And it's so important to grasp this. Mao was entrusting her with fundamental political theory, his core ideas, during a time of intense military struggle and, frankly, uncertainty about the future. Strong wasn't just covering a war. She was absorbing the philosophical bedrock of the regime that was about to take power.
But then comes this incredibly dramatic twist. Almost unbelievable, really. A moment that just perfectly encapsulates the Cold War tensions brewing between Moscow and the newly victorious Beijing. In 1949, while traveling, Anna Louise Strong gets arrested in the Soviet Union
Yeah.
and charged as an American spy.
The irony is just staggering, isn't it? After decades of basically unwavering support for the Soviet system.
Decades.
The arrest was almost purely political. Strong had been, as the book puts it, loudly touting the praises of the Chinese, both back in the U.S. and within earshot of Moscow. And she was suggesting, and this was the unforgivable part for Stalin, that the torch of revolution had passed from Moscow to Beijing, that Mao was the new, more dynamic leader of world communism.
That would not have gone down well.
Not at all. It was a direct challenge to Stalin's authority, to the absolute centrality of the Kremlin in the communist world.
Unacceptable.
So she's held for 6 days, expelled. And she finds herself totally isolated. She wrote later, quite bitterly, that even her closest friends, people she'd worked alongside for years, they immediately just towed the Moscow line. Can you imagine dedicating your life to a movement only to be instantly branded a traitor just for acknowledging the success of a parallel revolution?
It must have been a profound, crushing betrayal. She wasn't officially rehabilitated until 1955, after Stalin died. Her passport came back in 57. And at that point, she made a very clear, very final ideological choice. She went back to China in 1958. She was 72 years old.
Wow.
And she stayed there, living in, well, the relative ideological safety of Beijing compared to Moscow, until she died in 1970. And during this last phase of her life, she wrote The Letter from China, which was published in huge numbers, translated widely. It really cemented her role as the premier, sympathetic Western voice interpreting Maoism for the world. She literally picked a side. She chose the new revolutionary center, Beijing, over the old one, Moscow, and defined her final years as this absolutely essential bridge between Mao's China and, well, the rest of the world. Okay, so that sets the stage for the reporter. Let's move into the interviews themselves now, starting with that first one we mentioned, early March 1959. It took place at the East Lake Resort near Wuhan. And this meeting, it included Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois. Hugely symbolic. It was the first interview Mao had actually given to any Americans since he left Yan'an more than 10 years earlier.
Yeah, the symbolism was massive, and the atmosphere, according to the attendees, was surprisingly relaxed, very confident. Mao came across as buoyant, unworried, even joking quite a bit. He was wearing a simple gray wool suit. He seemed physically fit, energetic, moving quickly, despite, the huge difficulties China was facing with the Great Leap Forward at that time. The immense political weight of the man seemed softened by this immediate, almost disarming manner.
And his communication style, it was engaging, but also maybe intentionally provocative right from the start. He used these small personal interactions to build rapport, but also to make philosophical points, like the icebreaker, comparing his own deeply tanned hand to Dr. Du Bois's paler hand, and joking about which one of them was actually darker. It's a subtle challenge to conventional racial thinking, right?
Exactly. And he was also very aware of social dynamics, protocol. He managed the seating, for instance, by deferring to Du Bois as the senior honored guest. But then he turned to Strong and said something like, "You are the old friend. You've been here a long time. You're practically Chinese now. You are the hostess."
Ah.
So by making her the hostess, he's doing a couple of things. He's acknowledging their long relationship, yes, but he's also using Chinese custom, subtly, to guide the conversation towards his primary guest, Du Bois, while keeping Strong central. It's a masterclass in political politeness, really.
The conversation then pivots pretty quickly to the U.S., specifically the then Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. And this is where that paper tiger philosophy really gets applied to the contemporary Cold War context. Mao starts by joking, saying he wants to swim the Mississippi River, but only if Dulles, Nixon, and Eisenhower give him permission.
Right. The humor, though, it's just a setup for the core political theory. Mao then says something really controversial. He says he hopes Dulles lives a long time because Dulles is, ironically, very useful to us.
Very useful. How?
Well, when Du Bois pressed him, Mao explained. Dulles was useful precisely because his rigid, aggressive, anti-communist actions, suppressing people, setting up military bases all around China, creating alliances like Seato, all of that, Mao argued, served to mobilize the world's people against American imperialism.
That is a classic dialectical move, isn't it? Turning your primary enemy into a necessary catalyst for your own movement's growth.
Absolutely. And when Dr. Du Bois voiced this very understandable hope, that this period of intense tension would end soon, Mao's reply was firm. He said, "I disagree. The period is not too long, it is too short."
Too short. Why?
Because, in Mao's view, the longer Dulles kept up this tension-creating policy, the more it served as an education. It educates the Chinese people and the world's people about the true nature of imperialism. He didn't see tension as just a threat to be managed or avoided. He saw it as a necessary, almost mandatory educational tool for raising political consciousness globally.
And he backed this up.
Oh, yeah. To prove his point, he listed 12 specific world events from just the previous 14 months. Revolutions, political shifts, anti-colonial uprisings in Iraq, Lebanon, Venezuela, elsewhere, all of which, in his interpretation, were direct results of the instability caused by U.S. actions. He was weaving all this global tension into one single narrative, basically, of inevitable revolutionary momentum fueled by American overreach.
This philosophy also directly informed their immediate tactics, right? Which Mao illustrated with that famous anecdote about the Quemoy shelling crisis in the Taiwan Strait in 1958.
Yes, the teacup story. He literally used a teacup, an ashtray, and a pack of cigarettes on the table to sort of diagram the situation. He showed how the U.S. Navy ships, flying these huge flags so they couldn't be mistaken,
Right.
escorted the KMT supply ships right up to the 3-mile limit, maintaining this brink, this edge of conflict, but not crossing it.
So what was the lesson China learned?
Mao said China learned directly from Dulles' brink of war strategy. They learned to also stop at the brink. So the People's Liberation Army would bombard Chiang Kai-shek's transport ships heading to the islands. But they were incredibly careful never to hit the American escort ships.
I see.
They acknowledged and meticulously maintained that tactical line drawn by the enemy. It's a fascinating example of calculated restraint mixed with aggressive action. Learning from your opponent's playbook, not just reacting emotionally.
Now, understandably, the conversation touched on the fear of global war, especially nuclear war. Dr. Du Bois expressed concern that American Negroes might be exterminated in a nuclear exchange. How did Mao respond to that fear?
He offered this very calm, very politically framed reassurance. He said something like, "There are 18 million Negroes in America. It is impossible to exterminate them. It is the bourgeoisie that will be exterminated, not you or the working people of the world." A class-based reassurance, essentially.
And he brought in his personal losses, too, didn't he?
Yes, to kind of contextualize the human cost of this long struggle. He mentioned his own profound family losses. 6 family members killed during the revolution and the wars, including his eldest son in the Korean War. But even after acknowledging that immense personal cost, he maintained his strategic confidence. He said, "The more communists they kill, the more there will be." It's an anecdote that both humanizes the huge scale of the struggle, but also reinforces his absolute philosophical conviction that violence can't ultimately stamp out an ideology or a movement rooted in the people.
This focus on overcoming fear, on psychological barriers, led to a really interesting discussion about superstition and custom. Mao connected political fear, like the fear, or worship as he put it, of U.S. military might, to basic social habits and prejudices. He used the analogy of eating dog meat.
Right. It sounds a bit strange out of context, but his point was quite profound. He confessed that he himself, growing up, had considered only beef and mutton to be truly superior meats. But during the really harsh conditions of the Revolutionary War, sometimes dog meat was all they had. He found that once he overcame that conventional disgust, that social prejudice against it, it was actually quite good, sometimes even better than other meats they had.
So the political lesson is?
The political lesson is clear. You have to consciously overcome your ingrained social fears and conventional discomforts, like the overwhelming awe or worship of American power, to accept the new reality. The reality that even these massive forces opposing you are fundamentally just paper tigers. Psychologically intimidating, yes, but ultimately vulnerable.
Okay, and finally for this 1959 interview, they talked about the future, about the possibility of a Third World War. What was Mao's take then?
He stated pretty clearly that he didn't think a Third World War was likely, nor did he believe that nuclear stockpiles, even then, would completely destroy humankind.
He had a more long-term perspective.
Extremely long-term. This is where he offers this almost cosmic view going way beyond immediate politics. He said, look, even if the human race were totally destroyed, evolution would simply start over and produce a human race again eventually.
Wow.
But bringing it back to the present, he expressed confidence that the forces demanding peace around the world were actually too strong to allow total nuclear annihilation in the near future. It's a perspective that kind of minimizes the immediate existential threat of nuclear war by placing it against this vast backdrop of biological and historical time.
And what about domestic issues in 1959? He touched on the communes and industrialization.
Yes, he was quite candid, actually. He admitted the communes were facing significant organizational problems and, crucially, a severe shortage of steel. This was a major bottleneck for the Great Leap Forward, and this difficulty directly fueled his push for decentralized industrialization.
Why decentralize?
Mao argued very strongly that every region, every province, should develop its own local industry. The main goal wasn't just about economic efficiency. It was explicitly political, to avoid creating a big, centralized, bureaucratic machine. He feared that over-centralization would stifle local initiative, concentrate too much power in Beijing, and lead to the kind of bureaucratic rigidity he saw in the Soviet Union.
That anti-bureaucratic impulse, that push for decentralization, it's a theme that keeps coming back, doesn't it? It definitely foreshadows some of his later political movements.
Absolutely. It's a key thread in his thinking throughout this period.
Okay, let's move forward then to the second major interview, January 1964. This one took place in Beijing, in the old Winter Palace. Strong described Mao as looking bronzed and sturdy, relaxed and slow-speaking. He was 71 by then.
Yes, and he carried that authority of a longtime revolutionary leader, but still maintained that sort of easy, comradely atmosphere they remembered from Yan'an. He often started by recalling those early days.
How did he open this conversation?
He actually opened by talking about their shared history again. He revisited his decision back in 1947 to keep Strong in Yan'an, preventing her from leaving with the communist forces when they evacuated ahead of the nationalist attack.
Why bring that up?
Well, he used it as a bridge. He suggested, maybe with a bit of retrospective confidence, that the military campaign they waged against the nationalists after leaving Yan'an wasn't actually as hard as they'd fear it would be. And the main reason, because the people were with us. The popular support was overwhelming. And this personal reflection immediately pivoted into a broader discussion of military philosophy.
Right, and the military philosophy he shared here seems immediately relevant to almost any kind of strategic thinking, not just warfare. He talked about the huge imbalance they faced. Hu Tsongman's nationalist army had something like 450,000 soldiers.
Yeah, a massive force.
Against the Red Army's maybe 45,000 in that theater. 10-to-1 odds. How on earth do you defeat a force that much larger?
Mao used this really vivid, almost earthy analogy, catching fleas. He said, look, if you have 10 fingers and you see 10 fleas hopping around, you don't try to use one finger to catch each flea simultaneously. That's impossible.
Okay.
Instead, he said, you concentrate all 10 fingers on one flea.
Yeah.
You use overwhelming local superiority. You focus all your available force on one small segment of the enemy, crush it completely, bite it off, metaphorically speaking, and then move on to the next segment.
Concentrated force on a localized target.
Exactly. That strategy, achieving overwhelming superiority at the specific point of attack, even if you're vastly outnumbered overall, was absolutely key to their eventual victory against a materially superior enemy.
But he also stressed that this crucial insight, the strategy, was learned the hard way, right? Learned late and at enormous cost. He talked about 3 great principles of warfare that they ignored in the early days, much to their detriment.
Yes, and they sound almost comically simple. Men must eat, men must walk, bullets kill people.
The group apparently laughed when he said it.
They did, but Mao was deadly serious. He explained that some early revolutionary leaders, maybe blinded by ideological zeal, would assign military tasks as if soldiers didn't need food for weeks, or as if they could magically fly over mountains instead of walking. And worse, if commanders realistically pointed out that enemy bullets could, in fact, kill their soldiers, they risked being accused of lacking revolutionary spirit, of not having enough faith in the masses.
So ignoring these basic material realities had dire consequences.
Catastrophic consequences. It led directly, Mao argued, to the loss of their main base area, the central base in Kiangsi. And that loss forced them onto the Long March, that grueling, almost unimaginable 7,900-mile strategic retreat.
25,000 lie.
25,000 lei. It took that near annihilation, culminating in the critical Sunyi Conference during the march, to force a change in leadership, bringing Mao effectively to the forefront, and a fundamental shift towards a more realistic military strategy. It was a brutal lesson. Material reality must always ground ideological enthusiasm in warfare.
Okay, so from military strategy grounded in reality, the conversation then seems to merge very naturally into the absolute core of Maoist philosophy. The principle he called one divides into two.
Yes, and he explicitly stated, this is the heart of dialectical materialism. This was the central philosophical concept underpinning everything else.
Now, for our listeners, one divides into two sounds pretty dense, pretty philosophical. Can you break down what that really means, especially in a political context?
Sure. At its heart, it's the principle of inherent perpetual contradiction. It means that everything in the universe, every object, every system, every unity contains opposing forces within itself. And because of these internal contradictions, everything is constantly in a process of dividing, changing, and struggling. Nothing is static.
He used a scientific analogy.
He did. He used the analogy of splitting the atom. He said, first we learned to split the atom, then science learned to split the nucleus inside the atom. And then he confidently predicted that scientists would eventually figure out how to split the electron too. I think the electron will be split too, he said.
So constant division, constant change, driven by internal opposites.
Exactly. Internal contradiction isn't a flaw to be overcome. It's the fundamental engine driving all development in the universe and, crucially, in history and society.
And when you apply that idea to society, it has some pretty radical political implications, doesn't it? Especially for the traditional Marxist idea of achieving a final, peaceful, harmonious communist state.
Oh, absolutely radical implications. If contradiction is perpetual, if one divides into two is a universal law, then Mao argued that social contradictions will never disappear. Even in the highest stage of communism, society will still contain opposing elements, advanced, middle, and backward thinking, different interests, new struggles.
So no final resting point.
No. It means that political work, ideological struggle, constant vigilance against stagnation and bureaucracy will always be necessary. It fundamentally justifies the idea of a perpetual revolution, the need for periodic upheavals and rectification campaigns. Like the Cultural Revolution, he was clearly already planning to keep society dynamic and prevent a new ruling class or bureaucratic elite from emerging. He completely rejected the Soviet notion, especially prevalent under Khrushchev, that communism would be a state of permanent, conflict-free harmony. For Mao, struggle was eternal.
And this philosophical embrace of conflict, of contradiction, directly shaped how he viewed things like inter-party debates and rectification campaigns.
Definitely. He argued, first of all, that revolutionaries aren't just born wanting to be revolutionaries. They're usually forced into it by the reactionaries. He loved quoting that old Chinese novel, Water Margin, every rebel is forced to go into the mountains.
He applied that to himself.
He did. He said, basically, I didn't choose this path initially. I was forced onto it because the reactionaries killed too many people. Revolution arises out of necessity, out of opposing forces.
And this necessity of struggle then dictated how they should handle internal disagreements, people who followed the wrong line.
Yes, he argued strongly that when someone within the party had followed an incorrect political line, the goal wasn't just to crush them or purge them. The goal was to correct the thinking, to achieve change through persuasion and education, not primarily through force. They would actually publish books comparing the official statements and documents from the competing political lines side by side, encouraging party members to read both, compare them, debate them, and hopefully arrive at the correct understanding themselves. It was an attempt, at least in theory, at mass ideological self-education through struggle.
And this led to a shift in the slogans used during these internal campaigns.
A very significant shift. They moved away from the harsh slogans used during earlier periods, especially associated with what Mao called the left opportunists' slogans like ruthless blows and relentless struggle.
And replaced it with?
Mao introduced his famous, more, seemingly humanitarian dictum, treat the disease and save the patient, along with correct past errors to avoid their repetition, clarify thinking, and unite all comrades.
Was this just rhetoric, or did they practice it?
Well, Mao pointed to the fact that even the main leaders who had represented that earlier left opportunist line were actually re-elected to the Central Committee in 1956 as proof of sincerity. The idea was to demonstrate an organizational commitment to rehabilitation, to bringing people back into the fold once they'd recognized their errors, rather than simply eliminating opponents. It was a strategy, arguably, for managing internal contradiction, using the struggle to refine the ideology while maintaining overall unity.
Okay, so from internal party dynamics, let's broaden the focus again to the global stage in that 1964 discussion. This was dominated by the growing ideological war, really, between China and the Soviet Union, what Mao called the Great Debate.
Yes, the Sino-Soviet split was widening rapidly by then.
When Strong asked him how Washington viewed China at that point, what was his take?
It was interesting. He noted that the U.S. primarily saw the Soviet Union as the main enemy, the main target, simply because the Soviets had nuclear weapons. As for China, he said, they look down on us because we have no nuclear bombs, only hand grenades. But then he added, their contempt does us no harm.
Why no harm?
It ties back to that paper tiger idea and his view of imperialists. He saw being underestimated as a strategic advantage. He characterized the imperialists as philosophical pragmatists, meaning they only really take seriously those enemies who pose an immediate, tangible military threat like a nuclear-armed Soviet Union. China, being underestimated, had more room to maneuver, in his view.
But the real fire, the real ideological passion in this 1964 interview, it seems, was reserved for the Soviet Union under Khrushchev.
Oh, absolutely. Mao didn't mince words. He basically labeled Khrushchev's policies as phony communism. He argued that the Soviet revisionists, as he called them, were behaving just as badly as the Western imperialists in how they treated smaller or weaker socialist nations.
He gave specific examples of clashes.
Several crucial ones that really illustrate the breakdown. The first was back in 1958. Khrushchev visited Beijing and apparently pressed very hard for China to grant the Soviet Union joint naval bases on the Chinese coast, essentially demanding a Soviet military sphere of influence within China.
How did Mao respond to that?
Mao refused point blank. And when Khrushchev kept pushing, Mao reportedly replied with this icy sarcasm, suggesting Khrushchev might as well just take the whole seacoast while he was at it. And then, crucially, Mao told Khrushchev that if the Soviets persisted, he, Mao, would be forced to go back to the mountains and wage guerrilla war, essentially threatening armed resistance against the supposed elder brother of the socialist camp, an absolutely astonishing threat.
Wow. That really underscores China's fierce insistence on absolute sovereignty, even against their main ally at the time. What was the second clash you mentioned?
The second major clash was in 1959, right after Khrushchev had returned from his famous meeting with U.S. President Eisenhower at Camp David. Khrushchev came to Beijing to report to Mao, and according to Mao, Khrushchev proposed a solution for Taiwan. He suggested China should handle Taiwan the way Lenin had handled the so-called Far Eastern Republic after the Russian Revolution, essentially setting it up as a nominally independent buffer state, but really under Moscow's control.
That seems completely unrealistic for Taiwan.
Mao thought it was absurdly naive, totally detached from the reality that Taiwan was controlled by Chiang Kai-shek and backed by the might of the U.S. 7th Fleet. The analogy made no sense in the Chinese context. But what was even more revealing and infuriating for Mao was that Khrushchev simultaneously demanded that China release some American spies currently held in Chinese prisons. Why? Because Khrushchev had apparently personally promised Eisenhower at Camp David that he would get them freed.
So Khrushchev made a promise to the U.S. president involving Chinese prisoners without consulting China.
Exactly. And Mao's response, according to Strong's account, was simple and cutting. He just said something like, that would be rather difficult. We have laws in our country. Implying Chinese sovereignty and legal process couldn't just be overridden by a deal struck between Moscow and Washington.
How did Khrushchev take that?
The source notes that Khrushchev turned visibly red in the face. It was a moment of clear humiliation and highlighted China's absolute refusal to be treated like a junior partner or have its internal affairs dictated by Moscow's diplomatic needs.
Mao also had some pretty sharp criticisms about trade with the Soviets, didn't he?
Yes, and very practical, materially based criticisms. He made this cutting joke about Soviet exports to China. He said they had three main features. They were high in price, low in quality, and came in incomplete sets.
Incomplete sets?
Yeah, apparently China would receive a shipment of, say, factory machinery from the USSR, only to find that some crucial component, a specific transformer, a specialized part, was missing. And of course, that missing part could only be supplied by the Soviet Union, creating ongoing dependency and delays.
That led him to make a rather surprising comparison about trustworthiness in business.
It did. He quipped, almost as an aside, that between themselves, capitalists were often actually more trustworthy in trade dealings because they have to be. Their business depends on reliability.
Hmm.
The implication was that Moscow's state-controlled trade practices, at least in China's experience, sometimes fell short even of the standards of the capitalist West they both ideologically opposed.
Ouch. Okay, so the discussion then broadened out from the Sino-Soviet split to this major Chinese geopolitical concept, the intermediate zones. Strong was keen to get Mao's explanation of this.
Right. This was a key piece of Chinese foreign policy thinking at the time. Mao's first point was typically direct. China didn't invent these zones, he said. It exists. It's just a description of the actual material reality of global power dynamics.
How did he break down these zones?
He described two main intermediate zones sitting between the United States on one side and the socialist bloc, or what was left of it in his view, on the other. Zone 1 was the classic anti-colonial, anti-imperialist zone, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These nations were seen as the natural primary revolutionary allies against imperialism.
Okay, that makes sense. What was Zone 2?
Zone 2 was the more conceptually innovative part. This zone consisted of the developed capitalist countries, primarily in Western Europe, but also Canada, Australia, Oceania. Mao's argument was that even the ruling groups in these powerful capitalist countries were themselves being exploited, bullied, dominated, and interfered with by U.S. imperialism.
So even allies of the U.S.
Yes. Because of U.S. economic dominance, political pressure, military presence, Mao argued that contradictions existed even between the U.S. and its closest allies. This created situations where figures like, say, President Charles de Gaulle in France, who was actively resisting U.S. hegemony and pursuing a more independent foreign policy, could become, in specific instances, temporary tactical allies for China against the main enemy, U.S. imperialism.
It's a very flexible, pragmatic approach looking past strict ideology to find common ground in resisting American power.
Exactly. It allowed Beijing to engage with a much wider range of countries based on shared opposition to U.S. dominance, rather than just focusing on purely socialist states.
And Mao concluded this whole global overview by saying the world situation in early 1964 was actually excellent.
Yes, excellent. Despite all the tensions, he saw positive momentum. He pointed to what he called two claps of spring thunder that had just occurred early in the year. The mass anti-U.S. protests in Panama over the Canal Zone and the revolution that had just overthrown the Sultan in Zanzibar.
Even small struggles mattered greatly to him.
Immensely. He specifically mentioned that some friends had advised him not to pay so much attention to these seemingly small, localized struggles. But he insisted. He argued that the mass action in Panama, where ordinary people directly confronted U.S. armed forces over national sovereignty, was of the utmost importance. It demonstrated his core belief. Big revolutionary waves start from supporting and validating even the smallest acts of resistance against imperialism. Every struggle, everywhere, was interconnected and contributed to the larger global shift he envisioned.
Which brings us to the final interview documented in the book. This one took place on Anna Louise Strong's 80th birthday, November 24th, 1965, and it happened in Shanghai.
Yes, and ALS herself was apparently genuinely surprised. She knew there was going to be a birthday celebration, but the scale of it, and especially Mao's presence, was unexpected. Mao wasn't usually in Shanghai. He was traveling outside Peking at that time.
And this timing, this location, holds some hidden political significance, doesn't it?
Immense significance, which Strong herself only fully realized later. This interview, this whole birthday event, happened just months before the official launch of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Strong concluded that Mao had specifically gone to Shanghai because he was facing political resistance in Peking. He was unable to start the movement effectively in the capital, where some of his key opponents held positions of power within the party apparatus.
So the Shanghai birthday party wasn't just a party.
Not at all. It was a highly symbolic political gathering. By hosting this large, well-publicized event with many foreign friends and sympathizers in Shanghai, Mao was signaling his independent power base, his ability to operate outside the established Peking structure, and implicitly rallying support for the massive political upheaval he was about to unleash.
Yet, despite this storm brewing just beneath the surface, the atmosphere of the interview itself was described as having a deep tranquility.
Yes. Strong noted Mao seemed very relaxed, showing no outward signs of tension or worry. He spoke with this wide, almost philosophical perspective, taking in the grand sweep of human history.
He even maintained his characteristic teasing style right at the beginning.
He did. He opened the conversation by joking about the two factions present in the room. The smokers, like himself, and the non-smokers, like ALS. This led into a lighthearted little riff about authority, the conflict between his doctors, who were constantly telling him to quit smoking, and his own authority as chairman. He sort of playfully lamented the challenge, concluding with a smile, "It seems that in this too, I am in the minority." It was very subtle, very Mao way of acknowledging a challenge while simultaneously, implicitly, reaffirming his own power to choose his course, even against expert advice.
Now, you mentioned the large group of foreign guests, particularly Americans, at this event. Mao used their presence for a specific political message back home, didn't he?
Yes, the event received extensive publicity within China, and Mao clearly intended for the presence of these foreign friends, including Americans like Strong, to send a deliberate message to the 700 million Chinese people. The message was essentially, take note of the difference between the imperialist warlords running the U.S. government and the American people themselves, with whom we must maintain friendship. It was a classic tactic, separating the ruling elite of an adversary nation from its general population, keeping the door open for people-to-people diplomacy, even amidst state-level hostility.
And Mao's final philosophical thoughts in this 1965 conversation.
They were remarkably optimistic, but on that vast, almost geological timescale he sometimes favored. Despite the huge political battle he was about to initiate, he reiterated his belief that, in the grand scheme of things, humankind is only in its childhood now. He expressed, once again, his deep conviction that struggle, contradiction, and change are perpetual laws of the universe. He accepted the cycles of life and death, the long, difficult journey of humanity through countless ages, always moving, always struggling towards perhaps a higher level of contradiction, but never a final endpoint.
When you look back at these 3 interviews collected in this book, Anna Louise Strong's contribution feels really remarkable. She didn't just capture Mao the politician talking policy points.
No, not at all.
She somehow managed to capture Mao the philosopher, the poet, the long-term strategist. Her unique access, that long-standing trust, allowed her to record this perspective that seems to zoom out from, the immediate battlefield tactics to the very emergence of life on Earth and into the far distant future.
Absolutely. The real value of her work and why this book is so fascinating is that it preserves the directness, the flavor, the complexity of Mao's actual thought process in conversation. It provides this intimate, unvarnished window. You see his mind at work, synthesizing these profound philosophical concepts like one divides into two, with very concrete, practical decisions like why decentralized industry is necessary, or why supporting a seemingly small protest in Panama is strategically vital.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. What's the main takeaway for someone reading this book or listening to our discussion today?
For me, the ultimate takeaway from diving into this book is really seeing that profound, deliberate connection Mao made between his overarching philosophical framework and his day-to-day practical strategy. Strong captured that synthesis brilliantly. You see how he could connect the vast historical scale, humanity being in its childhood, evolution restarting if necessary, right down to the micro-tactical advice. Concentrate all 10 fingers on one flea to win a battle. It's that seamless flow between the abstract and the concrete that's so striking.
So the value for you listening to this episode of the Plain Books podcast maybe isn't about agreeing with or subscribing to the specific politics of Maoism in the 1960s. Instead, it's perhaps about recognizing the sheer power of that kind of structured, long-term, philosophically grounded thinking that Mao used to challenge the existing world order. That approach, the constant questioning of the status quo, the refusal to accept conditions as static, the drive to identify the internal contradictions in any situation and then leverage them for change, that mindset, regardless of your own field or beliefs, that might be the most practical lesson you can take away from this book.
Well said. It's about understanding a particular method of thinking about power, struggle, and change.
And perhaps we can leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, inspired by Mao's worldview as presented here. If Mao genuinely believed that political struggle, that polarization, that one dividing into two will continue even 10,000 years from now, even under ideal communist conditions, then what are the enduring, perhaps unresolvable dialectics that define our current society today? What fundamental struggles or contradictions are we perhaps mistakenly trying to suppress or ignore, rather than acknowledging and maybe even embracing them as necessary engines for future development and change?
It's a fascinating question to consider.
Definitely something to think about. We strongly encourage you, if this discussion has piqued your interest, to seek out the book itself, Anna Louise Strong. 3 interviews with Chairman Mao Zedong. Reading the original source always adds another layer of understanding. You can likely find it through major booksellers or perhaps your local library. We also invite you to engage with us, the hosts of the Playing Books podcast. Let us know your thoughts on this episode or suggest other books you'd like us to explore. You can find us on our social media channels. Just search for Playing Books Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Anna Louise Strong's unique encounters with Chairman Mao Zedong. We hope this exploration has offered some valuable insights into a pivotal figure and a turbulent period of history. Please do follow or subscribe to the Playing Books Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found this episode valuable, please share it with others who might be interested. We'll be back soon with another episode.